So in kind of round two, continuing to talk about actions, we started to develop a little bit deeper into a couple topics there that are, I would call, opportunity related, places where we might have an opportunity to invest to differentiate the state of Wisconsin. But we started the last session by looking at, potentially a different way to fund recruitment, fund the attraction of new talent to the state of Wisconsin. And as Jim joins the stage here, I want to toss a question to he and Darren to maybe give the audience here a sense of what's working in other states when it comes to recruiting out of state to bring those employees into those states.
Thanks, Jim. Employee incentives around the country take a number of different forms. They are generally oriented towards tuition reimbursement, student loan forgiveness, mortgage assistance, cash grants, and relocation assistance. I mentioned the Vermont program earlier. That is absolutely geared towards reimbursement of relocation expenses. The Tennessee Promise is free 2-year tech school tuition for anybody. Anybody that wants to move to Tennessee and go to school for free, you can do it. There are a host of others. New Haven, Connecticut has one that is designed around helping New Haven residents send their kids to 2- or 4-year college for free. So it's tuition support. It's also mortgage assistance. So there are a whole bunch of these kinds of programs. They're generally right around the $5 or $10 or maybe a little bit more than $10,000 awards per employee. Some of them are geared towards specific skill sets, like nurses or tech workers. Others are not. And very few, if any of them, have this sort of sustainable funding concept that we've talked about here, where both the business and the state are essentially funding this kind of program in arrears. As the monies come in through tax payments and benefits to the employer, then the employee gets a benefit over the next 5 years.
All of that, I agree with everything Darren just said. I think that the other thing to watch and look at, however, around the concept of sustainability is it's not just about money in terms of where the money comes from. Clearly that's an important piece, but it's how you spend the money. And you being the employee, you being the employer, et cetera. And if you look over the last 10 or 15 years, what you look at, the things that will pop at you as Austin took place, okay? Shot up like a reed, okay? Eau Claire is having its moment. Dane County is having its moment in that thing. The question is, however, if we just run after the audience or the target market of the next 2 to 3 years and we chase, as I've said, debt service, housing, et cetera, well, that's great, but what about 5 years down the road? What about 10 years down the road? And what we know is that the millennial workers are now having families, they're actually having children. And so the question that you have to address if you're going to be sustainable is, how attractive are we to that young worker family as they now have children in education? How attractive are we to that young worker family when they start to become middle-aged worker families and have to worry about the cost of higher education or technical training or what else it may be? What do we look like as we try to save both our rural populations and our aging populations and ask ourselves, what does that take as a community? And so the forward piece, if you're looking for a longer vision, a more sustainable piece, is to look down the horizon and understand how what you're doing now can help you be more competitive 5 years out, 10 years out, what have you, okay? Because the field's going to be crowded at that front end where we're just spending money, okay? We can't outbid New York, and we're not going to outbid other places. But what we can do is show them things. I mean, the Secretary Hughes talked about quality of life in Wisconsin, and I mentioned earlier, we have 16 markets, 17 markets in this state, okay? Eau Claire is a real place with real history, with real energy. So is La Crosse, so is Appleton, so is Oshkosh, so is Milwaukee, Racine, Kenosha. All of those places have stories to tell, not all positive. And so you begin to ask yourself, how do you put these pieces together, and how does that go with that $20,000 investment? So yes, we want to put housing on the line, but we want to make sure we're talking about affordable housing. We're talking about workforce housing. We may want to be more concerned about where that housing is, et cetera, okay? Rather than just saying any old house you want to buy, okay? There are a variety of different ways to look at this.
To follow up on that and maybe go to the panel members here just immediately to my left, Jim and both Darren talked about, different funding option that might be available to us to attract talent. I mean, given the changes that we've seen in workforce development in the recent years, are there changes in funding allocations that we might consider to produce better outcomes going forward?
Well, let me encourage Naira to talk, because and I'll try to say this in fewer words, which will be American Family is one of the few companies in the country that is involved in social impact investing. This is a major, major step forward in terms of re-envisioning the company's relationship with it, not just its local community, but its broader communities and its consumers and all the rest of it. It is about thinking about intersections, okay? And where you can empower intersections and where you can encourage vision. And so I think the answer is yes. I mean, I see Naira's here about opportunity.
Thank you for that. That was pretty awesome.
You got me excited.
I know. Look at that. I am absolutely a part of American Family Insurance, but I work for, as Jim kind of alluded to, part of the organization which I refer to as an extension of our corporate responsibility strategy. So I work for the American Family Insurance Institute for Corporate and Social Impact. And we are a venture capital firm that invests in early stage social impact startups. So we look at a lot of the issues that have been talked about already today. We look for investment opportunities in those spaces. So resilient communities. So if you think about the shocks and stresses that many of our communities suffer from and have to deal with from an environmental standpoint, we look for startups as well as organizational partnerships, strategic partnerships that are mitigating the impacts of that. K through 12 education, particularly around healthy youth development. So the trauma that many of our youth face because they have an environment at home that may not be conducive to their learning. So startups and partnerships that try to mitigate the social, emotional, and mental stress that many of our youth are exposed to, but also that their adults that have to care for them are exposed to as well. And then academic learning and achievement. So how can we help close equity gaps in educational disparities within the K through 12 space, and then economic opportunity for all, which is my area of focus, which looks at how do we provide access to mainstream financial services for communities that have been left out of this conversation. So investments in fintech, as well as investments in justice tech. So we look for startups that are helping mitigate issues related to recidivism. So we look for founders that are formerly incarcerated, as well as startups that may look to provide support for those individuals as well as their families. And so for us, this venture capital model of investment, we feel becomes a sustainable way for us as an organization to support innovation in social impact. We also feel that because this is an extension of our corporate responsibility strategy, that is a way that we can attract and retain not only tech talent, but next generation diverse talent. Because we know, as we talked about with the millennials and Gen Zers, they are socially involved. They believe in organizations that are purposely driven. The CEO Roundtable put out a report late summer that talked about it's not just about shareholder value, but it's what's the value you're bringing to your employees and the communities. And so in my video, I talked a little bit about that and how we engage with communities, and how we are very purposeful at the Institute in connecting with communities to understand the issues. So we can talk about incarceration, we can talk about the challenges of returning to communities, those returning citizens, but what are the real issues that they're facing? So we go to those communities, we go to the north side of Milwaukee, we ask what the challenges are, and then we look for startups to invest in that are solving those solutions. And then we also realize that part of this investment is in Main Street businesses. So we also look for startup idea or business ideas that could be trying to, could be attempting to mitigate some of these issues. And we look to provide support to those businesses as well. So that's one way that we're looking to not only invest in communities, but we feel that these activities also will help us attract and retain talent.
So you spoke to that talent piece, and how the Institute and social impact investing is directly connected to American Families' efforts to attract the next generation of talent as well. I kind of know the answer because we work together on this, but I'll still toss the question to you. I mean, do you see that American Family has a chance to brand itself as a leader in this area when it comes to investing in opportunity, again, as a means of being more attractive to future talent?
I think so, particularly when you look at issues, and I'll focus on incarceration because that's where I spend a lot of my time, is in that space and understanding that space. I feel that that's a differentiator because that's I feel like the people in this room get it because we've talked about the opportunity for that workforce. It's a touchy topic, and we know that with the changing demographic of society, we're going to be a majority-minority country in a few years here. When you look at the communities that are impacted by a topic like incarceration and you look at what those populations are going to look like, that's a topic that many individuals know firsthand. So we're not talking about a social issue that is distant from a lot of the folks that we're talking about right now from a workforce retention and attraction standpoint. So when you're talking about a topic that many have a lived experience with, when you have, zip codes within this state where 40-50% of the African American male population knows incarceration, that's a topic that I feel like can separate us. And so not only dealing with this topic on a local level, but then where are those conversations happening nationally, where we can engage and be at the table and help influence those decisions, influence policy, influence conversation, because if we're showing up nationally, we're relevant locally. And so I absolutely believe that helps drive attracting talent where these issues that we're looking at are important for them.
All right, thanks, Naira. And welcome, Kaleem. I'm going to let you get settled for just a second, and then I'm going to toss a question to you. But first I want to come back to Secretary Frostman, because you talked about a little bit about incarceration and meaningful reentry back into employment. Are there things that the private sector can do a better job of, can do more of in this space to assist with that meaningful reentry?
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of employers start with just kind of broadening their perspective and having an open mind. I think a lot of employers have told us that they voluntarily have banned the box and have kind of rethought what were non-starter offenses, obviously while still being very careful for their workplace. But I think something we've seen be really successful is companies sharing their success stories. The greatest champions we have for reentry programming are the employers that have used it, and they are vocal and they are proud, and they tell us over and over again that the folks they either work with on work release or immediately after being released are some of the most dedicated folks because they want to stay in the straight and narrow. And so sharing your success stories and then also being willing to listen and being a little bit more open-minded. Like I said, we're grateful that this is a pretty unique time in workforce crunch, but that heightened sense of urgency has kind of opened a lot of folks' minds, and talk to those companies that do this and have had success with it, because they'll be able to share best practices.
Thank you. And so we've spent a little bit of time talking about opportunity in a couple areas, and Kaleem, on the video, you talked in particular about the potential game changer that exists with early childhood education and the potential for state investments there to set us apart. Just looking a little bit more broadly, do you see Wisconsin having the opportunity to be branded as a leader in this kind of broad topic of opportunity? And if yes, in particular, how might we go about doing that?
Yeah, sure, I do. Preschool education has been talked about quite a bit over the last 2 decades, and every politician, when it comes up, says that they support it. Rarely do you. I haven't heard actually anyone say that they don't support preschool education, early childhood education. The challenge is, again, how do you do it? And I do want to be very specific with you very quickly about how I feel we're going to do this in Wisconsin. Any state that takes the lead on ensuring that families have access to free, high-quality early childhood education, birth to 5, is going to win. Any state that takes the lead on that. There are states that are trying. Kansas and Missouri both are trying to do some things in that area. They've found ways to fund early education all the way to 3-year-olds, but not for everyone yet. Tennessee has also experimented with that. California's talked about it. So states are talking and looking at it. Wisconsin hasn't really had a formal proposal put before it yet about how it could do it. My organization, we started One City with the intention that we would create a model in our state and evaluate it. We just received a $1 million grant from University of Wisconsin's partnership programs. It's called the School of Public Health, where we're going to have for the first 5 years of our longitudinal study evaluated so that we can show people birth to 5 is where the investment should go. What our early data shows now is that for our children that have been with us as young as 2 and 3 years old, there's no achievement gap, absolutely zero. And we have 82% poverty in our school. And so we think that just from that standpoint, that's one thing. The second thing is a lot of families cannot afford early childhood education. Most people that are paying for it are somewhere between the ages of 18 to 34, 35. They're getting started in their careers. They don't have a lot of money. They're still continuing their education. And they're going to go, or they're going to stay where they can access significant resources to help pay for a high-quality program, which costs in Wisconsin somewhere in the neighborhood of $12,000 to $22,000, depending on if you live in a rural area or a city area, and it will cost more if you're paying people well enough to stay in that occupation. Our teachers make a base of $40,000. Nobody makes less than that, and they get full benefits. We give them other kind of perks too, which far exceeds what other preschools in general get in our community. But again, we think it can be done. And then anyone who decides to do this is going to lead on it, and it will save funds on other things that we're spending money on downstream to help solve the problems that we don't spend money on in the beginning.
I'm going to ask that kind of same question to the broader panel. Can Wisconsin be branded as a leader in opportunity? And if yes, how might we go about doing that?
As a leader in opportunity, that's pretty broad. I think every community, every state has its own attributes. And so we're not going to be branded as the place of beaches, but we have a lot of good things about our state. There's a lot of misperceptions about our state, so some of that is getting over those. So it's not just, shirtless people drinking beer with a cheese head on their hat and 10 degrees below the weather. So some of that is just changing our image, but it's also just, we have a lot of people who've moved away from Wisconsin, and bringing them home and getting the message to alumni and people who've been away. That can be a way. One of the things that happens, at the risk of mentioning my city again, Eau Claire, is that people who were in Eau Claire 10 years ago and people who come to Eau Claire now see a marked difference in what they see in terms of opportunity as well as the quality of the community. And so some of that is just showing the differences and getting over misperceptions, I think.